Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Tony Wright and I'm chairing it, as you can probably see. When I go to lectures these days, I don't often look forward to them. I don't know about you, even if I pretend that I am. But this one, I can honestly say I am looking forward to. I first encountered Colin Crouch when I went up as a student to the LSE in 1967, at the height of the revolution. And Colin here was president of the Students' Union, and he was being given this torrid time by these trots. And I just think it's wonderful that, here we are, God knows how many years later, and they're all in the city, all the trots, that is. And Colin is steadfastly pursuing this radical left-wing agenda, and that tells you a lot about how life has gone on. I think, and Colin has served his time in Oxford and Florence and Warwick and all the rest of it. But for the last 10 years or so, I think, and quite deliberately, he's set out to try to make sense of this world in a way that people, that is ordinary citizens, have got some chance of understanding. And he's written a series of books that have become essential reading for anyone who's still interested in exploring this complex relationship between capitalism and democracy from a position of someone who knows what he's talking about. And some of you will know the products of these labours, Making Capitalism Fit for Society, The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism, and just published The Knowledge Corruptors, Hidden Consequences of the Financial Takeover of Public Life. All available outside, knockdown price, £10. Do buy them if you haven't got them. And in those books, and in his writing in this last decade or so, he's invented phrases, he's invented a notion of post-democracy. He's invented, this one is not going to catch on so much, by the way. He's invented something called privatized Keynesianism.
Well, that's caught on.
Has it caught on?
Yeah.
Not in Birmingham, it hasn't. But this is all indispensable stuff for those of us who are trying to get to grips with what the hell is going on. So when Colin comes and gives a lecture, you know that it's going to be worth attending to. Even if it's got a very long title, we know that it's going to be tremendous. So what Colin's going to do is to lecture for about 40 odd minutes, and then there'll be equivalent time for discussion afterwards. Colin.
Thank you, Tony. Often when you address academic seminars, the chair will say, well, today's speaker is Colin Crouch. And I've just decided that's better than when you're set up. I think we've been running these political quarterly annual lectures for about a decade now. And I think when they were first proposed in the board, probably by Tony himself, I think I was the only person who actually opposed the idea. As I said, even fewer people wanted to come to lectures than wanted to give them. Well, I was sort of wrong, I suppose, because thank you very much for so many people turning up here this evening. In the little flyer I sent around to advertise this lecture, I drew on two recent events, or relatively recent events. One, the Volkswagen emissions scandal, and the other, the news that some National Health Service trusts were giving general practitioners, or were thinking of giving general practitioners incentives not to send people to hospital for tests. These seem totally disparate events, but to me they both had something in common about the way in which knowledge is dealt with and the way in which knowledge relevant to money and finance and profit making can trump other kinds of knowledge. Clearly, in the Volkswagen case, the knowledge that should be there about emissions was being cheated and we were being deceived because of the profit motive of the firm that trumped that very important notion of integrity in the preparation of vehicles for tests. In the case of the NHS incentives to doctors not to send patients to hospitals for tests, it's a different corruption of knowledge. It's about saying that the professional knowledge of doctors isn't necessarily to be trusted. We need to give financial incentives that might trump those professional incentives. So this is not a case of corruption in the straightforward sense of the Volkswagen case, but both cases, it's about the fragility of knowledge of various kinds in the face of very strong financial incentives and the pitting of financial incentives against other kinds of knowledge. Had enough weeks passed before I'd had to write the flyer, I would also have given as a third and again quite different kind of example the recent expose of the treatment of young people in the Medway Secure Training Centre by the staff of G4S. That might seem again completely separate from the other two cases, but if you look into the story, one of the things that's going on there is that in bits of the privatised public service, like young people's detention centres, staff are being recruited at a very low level. Very, very little is done for their training and their skill preparation, very little done to ensure their general competence. So again, knowledge of a substantive and professional kind that could be there is being trumped by the overwhelming need to make a profit, either because the thing is in the private sector or because it's in the public sector, but there's a great need to save costs. Now, all three of these cases came after I'd written my little book on the knowledge corruptors, but each of them illustrates one of the three kinds of corruption of knowledge that I tried to look at in that book. And so the problem of how far profit maximization and the pursuit of financial targets ought to govern corporate behavior, which is there in the Volkswagen case. I didn't have the Volkswagen case to draw on, but I did have the pollution of the Gulf of Mexico by British Petroleum, where geologists and other scientists were reporting to the firm, look, this stuff is not safe, and they were being told, tough, to do something about this would be just too expensive, we've got to take the risk. Very similar rationalizations in Fukushima in Japan, the electric power plant that had the misfortune, I mean, it's not the Tokyo Electric Power Company were not to blame for the tsunami, but they were being warned by their scientists that their plant would not be able to withstand various kinds of disaster. The knowledge was disregarded because of the overwhelming need to meet profit targets. Different from these cases, but in the same ballpark, were the Libor and Forex scandals, where people running very, very important parts of the financial system were distorting the knowledge that they had about how the markets were functioning. Distorting knowledge, for example, in the Forex case, distorting knowledge about what the exchange rates between various currencies were in order to make enormous profits at the expense of almost everyone in the world in the end. Certainly very large numbers of individuals, corporations, various organizations, and the customers of all those organizations who were being cheated because of a corruption of knowledge going on in the pursuit of profit. Another kind of case is the evidence that one occasionally gets that pharmaceuticals companies are only allowing favorable reports on their new drugs to be reported. And they're suppressing negative reports, not necessarily reports that say the drugs are harmful, but reports that say the drugs don't do very much. They tend to try to suppress those reports. So knowledge can be a victim of a pursuit of profit or the pursuit of financial targets as opposed to other ones. So financial knowledge, which is an extremely sophisticated kind of knowledge, is becoming a kind of mother of all knowledge in many of these areas. And that's worrying. And it leads to a question, how do we expect people to behave if they are in sectors or activities where they're told you really have got to make as much money as possible. That's what you're here for. Or that's one of the things you're here for. How do we expect them to behave when there's a clash between that and other goals? Do we expect them to have a kind of professional integrity or a sense of corporate responsibility that says we can't go down this road, we've got to be willing to restrain, we've got to be willing to go without some profits that we might make in order to ensure that profit doesn't trump everything else? Do we want them to do that? Are we willing to trust them to do that? Are we willing to let them define where those boundaries are? And there's very interesting debates in the business world around corporate social responsibility, the notion that firms ought to have some concern for the externalities produced by their activities, for example. Now, up until a number of years ago, there was quite a stock answer in the business world to that, and that was, our job is to make profit. That's what we're here for. If you want to restrain our activities, and if you want us to fish in certain ways, if you want us not to employ slaves in China, then you've got to have legislation to do that. It's not our job to make these decisions, it's democracy's job to do that. They don't say that so much anymore, perhaps because so much of our life is subject to corporate lobbying that we know if we go and try and do anything politically, you'll find that those same corporations there saying, don't interfere with us. And so in a way, as part of the sort of subtle exchanges that go on in the political world, corporations have sort of said, well actually they do sometimes say this explicitly, because when I worked in a business school, I worked with some of these people in the CSR area. They say, we have shown in the private sector that we can do things better than governments. Therefore, we have both a right and a responsibility to take responsibilities generally in society. We can't just behave as all we're here to do is make profits, because if we leave regulation to governments, they'll mess it up. We've got to do it. And it's not easy to decide. Does one want them to pursue profit and say, no, you just do what you're meant to do, and we'll regulate you from outside? Or do we say, we'd like you actually to make sure you behave according to some kind of ethical standards without specifying what those are? It was very interesting after the financial crisis of 2008. There was a lot of talk about, well, not just the financial crisis, but all the scandals like Forex and Libor and Euribor and the other things. A lot of talk about the need to change the corporate culture of the financial sector. And Barclays, for example, sacked their CEO, who'd presided over the last bits of the crisis, and appointed a man with a known record for integrity and professional values. They sacked him after 3 years, just a few months ago, and they said, we need a different skill set now. And they've gone back to someone from a hedge fund. And the financial, well, it's not called the Financial Services, what's it called now? The Financial FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, recently announced just a couple of weeks ago that it was no longer pursuing its project of trying to change the corporate culture of banks. Now, whether Barclays and the sector in general are considered now to have been mended, or whether there's been a general election since it was decided they ought to be mended, we'll have to see. So that's one area where I said there can be a clash between the dictates of financial knowledge and the dictates of other kind of knowledge. It's all about the knowledge that you use in your business activities, or your professional activities. There's a clash, and often, not always, often there is a tendency for the financial targets to trump the other kinds of knowledge, and this can be worrying. The second area where I looked at, which I say the example that's happened since I wrote my book, was this one of doctors being given a financial incentive not to send people to hospital for tests. This is about when a professional service ethos or a public service ethos is trumped by either financial targets directly, financial incentives, or by analogues of financial targets. Now, my book came, that particular example in the NHS came too late for my book, but just as I was going to press, there was another one that I did manage to get in, actually, and that was the one which is in a way it's a smaller one, but more complex, and that was when it was believed that not enough general practitioners were diagnosing patients as having Alzheimer's. And a solution that NHS England came up with was that they should be given £55 for every patient they diagnosed with Alzheimer's. It was met with shock and horror among old people and laughter among younger people. So if you laugh just now, you consider yourself to be quite young. Now, this is an interesting one, because, see, the first one, giving people incentives not to send people to hospital for tests, you can say this is cost-cutting, right? This is reducing the cost of tests in the health service. This is the opposite, probably. People who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, probably there's more costs going to come on, there's more demands going to be made, so this was not a cost-cutting case. It's a genuine case of people worrying, saying, they're not diagnosing people with a disease that they have, and you diagnose that as, you say that's a problem that general practitioners have. They're not alert enough to this. What do? Do you say we need to give them more training? We need to have in-service courses on recognition of these things in elderly patients. Perhaps give them an incentive to come to the course, but that's what we need to do. No, the route is you offer money. So here the notion is that if there's a problem of performance, the solution is to offer money, and that will be better than trying to improve the professional skills and professional judgment of the people involved. And that's what raises the interesting issue of the relationship between professional knowledge of various kinds and financial or analogous incentives that are outside the actual area of professional judgment. In the public services, most of the cases of this kind of targeting comes from the analogues of finance rather than actual money. And this is something that many of us are aware of from our own working lives. We're in health services, in schools, universities, police forces. There are targets that have to be achieved, which are set by an authority somewhere. And your decisions as to what you should do and what you should prioritize are determined very heavily by the need to meet these targets. And that then raises the problem of what does this say about professional judgment? It is saying that at certain points you expect professionals to subordinate that judgment to the need to fulfill targets. And one of the striking examples of where this has gone wrong was in part of South Yorkshire, where a number of women complaining of having been raped were really being put off by the police. They were just being encouraged to withdraw their claims. And a House of Commons committee looked into this, and the police said, well, it's not one of our targets, right? And we've been told to prioritise burglary, car theft. These are the things that affect people's perception of police work. These are the things that are leading people to think there's an increase in crime. We've been told, get these under control. We're not told to deal with women coming complaining about rape. That's not one of our targets. And the resources we devote to that are resources we won't devote to the other things, and we'll miss our targets and be told we'd failed. So the House of Commons committee said, well, you've got to change this. And so they said, we will. And they said, this is now a strategic objective, is that we must help women complaining of rape. But it didn't solve the problem. And then there was another inquiry, and they said, well, we didn't actually change the targets. We changed the strategic goals, but we didn't actually change the targets we gave individual police stations about their work. Now, this is a world in which, I'm assuming, the judgment of police is supposed to be governed by their targets. They shouldn't be saying, damn the targets, we've got a problem here, women being raped. Because their job is to obey the targets. You will get similar stories from schools, hospitals, certainly from university research priorities. And there's then there's an issue about, and later on I'm going to come to these issues of where do we stand on the relationship between professionals and those who set targets for them. So I'll postpone that. At the moment I'm just raising it as an issue. I'm not coming down on a side because it's important people do meet targets that have been set. But there's something else that we then do in the professions, and that is we game targets. Right? I mean, it's one thing to try and follow a target. It's another thing to fiddle the stuff, to fiddle the numbers, fiddle the data. And we know that that does go on. So, for example, stories of schools entering children for the same examination from different exam boards just because these were high-performing children. So you could get lots of grade A's at mathematics if these same 5 girls sit the same exam 4 times from different boards. Doesn't do them any good at all, doesn't do the country any good, but the school can count it up. Or schools that have been hiving off to children. This is only really possible to do if you're a school outside the main local authority system. An academy or a free school, you can hive off pupils who are very low performing into another unit, and you don't enter them for examinations, and so the number of children being entered is much lower and much closer to the number of those who are going to succeed, and you somehow lose these children in the numbers. This was a scandal exposed in The Guardian a couple of years ago. So there's one thing is when we say, how do we feel about setting targets from outside a profession that might distort the judgment of the professionals, might improve it. That's one issue. But then the incentive to gaming, which is of course the same as what was going on in the Volkswagen case, where you've got some criteria you've got to meet, and you say, right, how can we fiddle it? Right. So that's the whole second area of where there is this problem of the incentives that either finance, money, or its analogues give, which change the judgment of us in our working lives and the way we conduct our business. Then there's a third area which is a bit different from that last one, and it's this one that happens mainly with the contracting out of public services, although it doesn't necessarily require contracting out. But often what happens with contracting out is that firms, they've got a contract to do some public business. They've got to cut costs. They want to maximise their profit, to win the contract. They've got to try and reduce costs. And they then start to press around on what it is they can reduce. And one of the areas where, interestingly, in certain kinds of service, and I'll talk about what kinds of service in a few minutes, what people are doing is cutting down on skills and on the use, the role that's being of skills, not necessarily of high quality professionals, but of care staff, of staff at various levels. And I said the G4S Medway case was an example of that. Another example where clearly inappropriate staff, inappropriate supervision, inappropriate training, the sexual abuse of women in immigration detention centre at Yarl's Wood. That was Serco. Serco and G4S, this is slightly different from the abuse of knowledge, but G4S and Serco have both been involved in a major scandal about 3 years ago where they were responsible for the prisoner tagging service, and they charged government up for an extraordinarily large number of people they never actually tagged, and there were several millions of pounds involved in this scam. It was revealed. Those particular contracts were taken away from them and they were fined. But they are still among the 4 or 5 firms that dominate the privatisation of public services. Serco and G4S have not been regarded as being unfit to do this business now because of the scandals. Probably because, like the banks after 2008, they are too big to fail. That too much of our public service has become dependent on these small number of companies. We can't take the risk of saying they're not competent to do the job anymore. Just as no one can decide that just because HSBC smuggled, bankroll drug smugglers and terrorists. The world daren't get rid of HSBC. It's too big to the banking system. So we have to accept what these people do. And in several areas of privatized public services, there's insufficient incentive elsewhere in the system to check that kind of behavior, because to confront these corporations who've become so big would require quite a major political effort. It's not happening. Now, there's a kind of trade-off. The cases I've described, and another couple I'll talk about in a minute, they're all cases of the unpopular minority part of the care system. Children in care, old people in old people's homes. These are not people that really carry any clout in society. It doesn't really matter what's done to them. There'll be a scandal for a few weeks, but illegal immigrant women in a detention centre, who cares? We're not getting this kind of cutting of skill levels and cutting of service quality in schools and the health service. Someone will probably tell me where they are, but it seems nothing like, because, and this is, in a way, this is a kind of black victory for democracy, right? That you can only really risk ignoring the plight of these small, unpopular minorities. But things like the fact that care workers going around visiting old people and very disabled people are timed to the minute by the time they're allowed to spend with these people. So if you suddenly go and you discover Mrs. X has got some dreadful problem, you can't spend 20 minutes with her and go back and say she needed 20 minutes care. No, 5 minutes she was allocated. And you won't be paid if you spend 20. And those care workers aren't allowed to have a professional judgment about what their client needs. Their firm has a number of incentives, of targets that have to be met to make a profit, and any professional care feelings they have to be subordinated to that. It's very interesting. We've had in this country in the last few years, where it's continuing now, a number of cases of girls being forced into prostitution in various northern towns, also in Oxford. And there are 3 stories you can tell about these. There's one that is the story for the neoliberal right, and that is that it's all because the police are public servants and useless and don't do their job. Then there's the sort of right-wing, traditionalist right-wing argument, says, well, they're all a load of Muslim men, what do you expect? And then there's the left-wing one, and that says, well, these children's centres are increasingly owned by private equity firms, what do you expect? I suspect there's truth in all 3 of these, but our prejudices lead us to prefer different ones of the interpretation. But certainly one of the things, it's been the least talked about, although it was the Daily Mail that originally did discuss it, that often when private equity firms own care homes, and whether it's for elderly people or for children, often their main reason for getting into this business is eventually to do sales in the residential property. And one reason why a large number of girls, mainly girls, also boys, are in care in places like Rochdale is that property is cheaper there. It's not because they come from that area. They come from somewhere else. They're sent there. If they come from Essex, it's too expensive to run care homes in Essex, so they're sent to Rochdale, where no one knows them, where they've got no links at all with the local community. There's a few ill-paid care workers looking after the children's home. Otherwise, they're totally alone. It's not surprising things go wrong. So what I've depicted is a number of different ways in which financial incentives are among the incentives, or knowledge about finance and its needs, and knowledge about the analogues of finance, are there alongside other judgment rules, professional criteria, affecting the behaviour of people in firms and in public services, professions, and where there's a question of what is the balance among the financial incentives and those other incentives. I'm not arguing that once upon a time everybody was lovely and honest and then suddenly neoliberalism started and the world got corrupt. I'm not arguing that at all. I've no idea whether this kind of problem is bigger now than it was in some kind of past. It may well be we are more willing to talk about this kind of issue now. But there's more, we're less deferential, whether it's to governments or professions or to firms. We're more demanding about knowledge. We regard knowledge as something important to our lives, so we're interested in how it's being used. So I'm not claiming there's any actual increase in a problem. I'm just saying there's a problem here of the relationship between finance and other criteria of judgment. And it certainly, whether it's bigger now or not, it certainly is a very characteristic problem for our age. An age in which there are extraordinary rewards to be had in a society of increasing inequality among different kinds of human activities, and where money is used as a criterion of value. People are evaluated by their wealth and by their income. Not that's always been the case, but it certainly is characteristic of our period that money has a very, very high importance. And when that happens, one has to worry. There is the famous liberal dictum, all power corrupts. All power corrupts absolutely. Money corrupts. It's extraordinary that at the moment, association football, athletics, probably tennis, are all in the grip of major corruption scandals. We are an age that's very vulnerable, it seems to me, to the corruption of finance. And originally I was going to start my book, but I didn't in the end, with the story of King Midas. The mythical king, the gods give him this blessing that anything he touches will turn to gold, and then eventually he touches his daughter. And the moral of the story is, a lot of things you do want turn to gold, right? A lot of time you do want money, but there are some values, like your daughter, that you don't want converted into money because there's a value outside and superior to it being a golden object. And that's really the issue I'm trying to get at. When is it we want financial criteria to trump? Because sometimes we do, right? We don't want to waste money on anything. And when do we and how do we decide when other criteria have to come alongside the financial criteria and trump them? And the problem is partly that we are extremely dependent on knowledge of a numerical kind in our societies. That money appears to us in numbers, financial targets are always numbers, and we often need numbers in order to make decisions. And as the Volkswagen scandal shows us very clearly, we need to be able to trust numbers in order to make many of the decisions that affect us. Now, the title I've given this talk, which doesn't seem to have much to do with what I've been saying so far, was originally going to be the title of my book, but the publishers didn't like it, and they're probably right. But what I wanted to do was to look at how different figures, different kinds of person, different roles, if you like, should need to confront this problem of the relationship between financial criteria and other criteria of judgment. The money men are the people in the background who are controlling this world of increasing importance on financial criteria. I've called them money men because of the alliteration, but I don't think any feminists are going to want me to talk about money women or money persons, because no one really wants to be associated with them. So the money men are in the background. The citizens are ourselves trying to act as responsible people, trying to make decisions and judgments, either as customers, as I'll talk about in a minute, when we buy things, or as users of services, or as employees, or as people providing services, making decisions about them, acting in various professional roles. So the citizens with both rights and responsibilities to ask the question, how should I act? And how do I rank the financial incentives confronting me or confronting other people alongside other ones? The role of customer is one of the answers to that question, that as customers, we can in the market make a lot of choices, and we can use knowledge to decide where to go in order to get what we want. And often the market often provides the answer to the question, that through the market you can decide the balance of criteria you want. You can decide, for example, whether you want a less skilled service and pay less money for it. Problem with the market is that it doesn't solve all the problems. Often the information we need to make decisions in the market is not available to us as ordinary consumers. And although my book came too late for the Volkswagen scandal, I can boast that in the book I do actually say, as an example of this problem of our dependence on knowledge, just imagine we want to buy a car with only a certain level of emissions. Where do we go? How can we trust the kind of information available to us? And so as acting in the market, we often can't produce ourselves the information we need. We then have to trust other sources of information. Sometimes there are, for ordinary consumer activity, there are organisations like which that support the market, help the market function well. But often it's very difficult to get that information, especially when the people seeking to make profits out of the activities concerned have an incentive to conceal information from us for their own profit-making motives. So the market can't always help. The market, where the complete corruption of the forex markets, when the setting of foreign exchange relationships in that market, which cheated billions of people. There was no way people from outside could get at that. You couldn't make a judgment. You couldn't say, well, I'll avoid using that outfit, because there was only one anyway. So often when there's no true market, also, you can't use the market to do it. Now, here the Volkswagen case is interesting because it was an American regulatory agency, a public authority, that eventually produced the data that said, look, this is dishonest, and Volkswagen, therefore, will be punished through fines through the public system. But they'll probably take a harder hit from the market, because now customers are informed, and now the market can work, and presumably give signals to other firms not to go down that road. Unless the motor industry market turns out to be like the financial market. Because as I already said, none of the banks who were involved in the major scandals of recent years, they've suffered through heavy fines in the American, British, Swiss courts. But they haven't lost out in the market. But people who work for Barclays don't go around ashamed of themselves. People who work for HSBC don't hide and pretend they work for someone else. The three ratings agencies who failed to predict the weakening of banks and governments in the run-up to the crisis are still the three ratings agencies in the world. Reputational damage seems to be able to be dealt with when you've got a very small number of producers in a market. So the market helps us a lot. Being alert customers helps us a lot, but we can't rely on it thoroughly. And so naturally, we turn to regulation. And we get a lot, just as we get a lot through the market, we get a lot through public regulation. Eventually, it was public regulation that told us about Volkswagen. Public regulation prevents us from a lot of harm every day of our lives. But regulatory agencies aren't necessarily incorruptible. And politicians are the people who stand for regulation here. Politicians are extremely vulnerable to lobbying. It was interesting, following the Volkswagen case, we learned that the British, French and German governments have been lobbying the European Commission to allow car firms to game the emissions tests. Not in quite the way Volkswagen did, but letting them take these tests under lenient conditions to try and make sure fewer cars would fail. So in other words, trying to ensure that an indicator they claim they wanted to use could be undermined. We also know that 2 years ago, the environmental a part of the European Commission started to learn about some of the tricks that were being played by firms car firms to reduce their emissions on tests, and they reported this centrally to the Commission, and they were told, "Shut up! Do you want to hurt it? Do you want to hurt the motor industry?" So there is an extraordinary vulnerability to lobbying by regulatory agencies, both in the setting up of regulation and then in its conduct. And whether we're talking about the regulation of firms or of professional bodies, there is this fundamental problem that's very well known. Who has the knowledge that can advise regulators on what to do? Insiders to the activity concerned. Insiders to the activity concerned also have their own interests. And so public regulation has limits to how far it can help us. So how far then do we have to trust each other in our professional ethic? In a way, I suppose, the sort of the professional person, professional practitioner is the kind of, can be seen as the sort of hero of my book. And well, since I'm one of those people myself, I would do, wouldn't I? But we can't be trusted. That we have an incentive to use our superior knowledge to exclude laypersons from our area. We have very weak incentives to whistle-blow on colleagues who are performing badly or inadequately. If professionals were completely trustworthy, we wouldn't have had all the fuss about targets and so forth. So we can't, although there is a real problem comes when we say professional judgment has to be completely subordinated to financial incentives or targeting. We go to the other extreme and say just leave the professions alone and they'll behave themselves is also not an answer. Now my book ends very, very pessimistically like that, and I say that we can't be trusted, any of us, because we've all eaten of the tree of knowledge, and that's it. And the thing is, I was tempted by the tree of knowledge, and it was such a nice image to end with that I didn't sort of try and think beyond it. But really, all one can say is we need to make use of as many of these different mechanisms as we can. I mean, at the present time, there is a tendency in orthodox political thinking to rubbish both regulation and professions, and to advance the market as the master solution, which then leads other people to rubbish the market. We need all of these mechanisms. We can never have too many mechanisms, because if, as in the Volkswagen case, if professional reliability fails us, there might then be public regulation that will come to our aid. So as so often in our world, a pluralism of measures is the best we can hope for. You then just have to hope that the same group of interests are not able to control each of those different areas. Like, for example, supposing you have a market dominated by a very small number of enterprises that definitely places profit maximization above all other goals, which itself controls regulation and lobbies government very, very heavily to avoid regulation, and which also has professionals who have accepted that their work is completely subordinate to the goals of the corporations. If you were to get that sort of situation, then it would be very difficult to see how we can be protected. And of course what I've just described is the British tabloid newspaper industry, which is exactly that, which is why we had the Leveson inquiry, which was another thing that was forgotten just after the general election. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. And I mean, there's an awful lot to chew on there. And I think what would be extremely nice is if we could actually develop that last section a bit, and having set up the dilemma, professionalism, two-faced nature of relation to financial incentives and analogues of those, how do we find some secure territory in there? I think might be a nice thing to go. Anyway, let's chew on some of it. Who wants to have a go first? Yeah, David.
I declare an interest as a former employee of a regulatory and or audit organisation. That's my question. How offensive to principles of professional autonomy is the method of comparison? What the Audit Commission did at best was say of local government professionals, in condition X, you performed this way, in comparable conditions Y, you performed that way. We display the evidence for local political operators to use. Perhaps a more controversial example, you're both, as our colleagues in the room, university academics. The research excellent assessment, excellence framework as now is, at core is a way of comparing the performance of academics. Academics find the metric used often very oppressive, but what is wrong in principle with a comparative method, provided you have an external regulator who you trust, to secure that degree of honest activity by professionals?
Shall I collect or shall I?
Okay, should we take a few then, and then yeah, Malcolm.
Malcolm Dean. Can I just add two more to your list? The best one is what happened to the exam boards. If you remember, we were going to get rid of A-levels and GCSE and have diplomas after that great long report which came out unanimously in favour of this, everybody on it, universities, private, NUT, head teachers, everybody was in favour of doing it until what happened was Michael Howard in opposition said, no, we're not going to abandon the gold standards, which we knew they weren't, because the Telegraph and Mail would go for it. And then 6 months after that decision, the Telegraph put 10 reporters dressed up as teachers into the exam boards. And what they got was just absolutely amazing. The exam board saying, we don't know how this exam got through our regulator, but we can guarantee you'll get A's throughout our exam. It is the easiest one in the field, and we really urge you to take it. So that was, and then I think the other thing worth exploring or adding in your next book was the Landley's attempt to say, let's get the food and drink industry to be voluntary, reducing salt or sugar or wherever the three other, and fat in the other one. And of course, all the health people moved out, refused to join the board, and we didn't get much. We have now had reduction in salt, but as you know, we haven't had much reduction in sugar.
Shall we collect examples?
Take one more, Bruce.
Yeah, in the back.
Yeah. Hi, thanks very much. I wondered whether there might be a space in this for what you might call diligent amateurism, against, to some extent, expertise and professionalism, to cultivate the idea of diligent amateurs who can call to account, to some extent, professionals and experts. I have a certain fondness for sort of amateurism. And it's kind of something that would, it doesn't mean that one is kind of, in a sense, making an argument for sort of inefficiency and the denial of knowledge and so on, but to call to account, I mean, professionals and experts, appropriate the knowledge for their own purposes. I think the widespread cultivation of the sort of persona of the amateur, the diligent amateur, might counter some of these in some ways. It sort of add to your list of personas, as it were. Yeah.
You might regard Parliament. No, that's not a joke, by the way. That's not a joke. As a kind of diligent amateur, but
yeah. Well, let me come back to these. Because obviously I could only do an extract of what I wanted to talk about. I do have a big discussion about the kinds of external monitoring and regulation that help. And the Audit Commission is an excellent example of how these things work well. in that you had something there that worked by detailed inquiry. It didn't just set up a load of target numbers and see if they'd been met, as is increasingly the case with schools inspection nowadays. It did thorough reports. It used that comparative method, as you say. And it had a dialogue with the people it's regulating. Now, that, it seems to me, is about as good as you can get. Provided two things can be avoided. One is the role of special interest lobbies. And there, well, I'm going to come back to, responding to Graham Thompson, I'm going to come back to another aspect of that. But there's a certain, one does recruit people of enormous professional integrity, known professional integrity. You avoid lobbying of the thing, and you don't use, you reduce to a minimum, or you put in a context the use of targets. And the school inspection is a very good example of this, how school inspections used to be very detailed reports, a very expert team of people went into a school, and they would then write a lengthy report that the teachers could use. Now, once it became decided that there needed to be national league tables of schools, you couldn't have it that schools were visited once every 10 years, as it was being the case with the schools inspections, probably under any system that was too infrequent. You needed to have a lot of inspections every year. You therefore needed to recruit inspectors of a far lower level of expertise and professional skill, because the old inspectors had been a kind of elite of the profession. Sometimes they're now redundant school teachers. And also there wouldn't be time to write detailed reports. And also what parents wanted was a league table, a score, a number put by a school where they could rank it against other schools and decide whether they wanted the child to go there, because you're trying to create a market. And so school inspection became degraded from the kind of audit commission sort of inspection to one of box ticking, which is what has happened to it today. So yeah, there's degrees of quality of regulation. The audit commission was a splendid example, which is probably why it was abolished. Yeah, and Malcolm Dean's examples are very good. Yes, exam boards that have a kind of incentive to make their exams attractive, because they're in a market, you see. Now, that kind of market is very odd. It's a bit like the market for ratings agencies, that what you're buying is a rating of yourself. Now, why on earth wouldn't you therefore not go to the person who gives you the softest rating? Now, the reason is meant to be that eventually the world will find out. If the people coming out of a particular exam board with grade A are consistently seen by employers and universities to be not up to scratch, they'll start asking questions about that exam board. If a ratings agency constantly rates Icelandic banks as AAA when actually they're collapsing, eventually people are meant to get wise to that and say, we won't use that ratings agency. Now, the problem is that, and it's a real problem of knowledge, it takes a very long time. Well, there are two different cases. In the case of exam boards, it takes a very long time for that kind of information to be so manifest and so widely shared to have a consequence. In the case of the ratings agencies, you have a triopoly, and so there was no way anyone could go to different ones. So there is a problem when you're selling these knowledge-related things. The food and drink case is also interesting, and the biggest case there, well, it's not the biggest case actually, but the most popularly understandable case is what happened to the traffic light system of ingredients. There was this, the British Food and Drug Agency, Food and Drink Agency, came up with this idea that you could label ingredients under a traffic light system of red, there's too much of a harmful thing in here, amber on the margins, green, okay, low fat. And you could do this for each product, each ingredient, and you would put that on the front of packaging. And this went to the European Commission and the European Parliament, and they were subject to enormous lobbying from the food industry. And eventually it was decided, no, there shouldn't be any traffic light system. There should just be a series of numbers. These don't have to be on the front of the packet. There's no requirement as to their minimum size. So if you go looking for the ingredients on most things, you will find an extremely small black and white writing on the back, which is not how firms operate when they want to draw attention to their products. And there the European Commission and the European Parliament both gave in completely to the corporate lobby and suppressed and distorted knowledge. Interestingly though, because sometimes the market works when regulation doesn't. Certainly in this country, nearly all the supermarkets, who are not the food producers, right, and their interest is not in necessarily protecting the manufacturers of high-fat foods. The supermarkets said we'll use the traffic light labelling on many of the products that go through us. Tesco eventually started off by standing out against that and said we're not having any of this nonsense, but they had to give in. So there the market worked. As offered for certain products protection where the public regulatory system failed us. Graham Thompson's point about diligent amateurism and the point here about the Parliament. This is what politicians are for. They're meant to do that. The problem with politicians is that they are the voice of the people, but they also have their own interest in deceiving the people, and they are vulnerable to lobbying. And it's very important that certain areas of what we see as public things are not able to be controlled in a partisan way by governments. We take that for granted in this country with statistical agencies. If you heard that the National Statistics Authority took its orders from George Osborne, you would be very worried. In Greece, you would take it for granted. That's what happened, which is why Greece entered the euro, because it had dodgy numbers. There are certain we will be, as I say, we will be horrified when the BBC is eventually dismantled and bits of it sent off to Conservative Party's friends in the press. We want certain kinds of knowledge provision to be in the public zone and not owned by anyone, like the profit maximising exam board. We want them in the public zone, but we have a problem of trusting politicians who have their own motives and their own vulnerabilities to control them. And I think here really that we need to do something that in this country we simply don't like doing, but more likely to find in the United States or parts of continental Europe, and that is an acceptance of bipartisan appointment of a whole load of people. And is it right that the Chancellor of the Exchequer appoints the head of the Office of Budget Responsibility? Or should this not be something that has to be agreed in a cross-party committee? At the moment we have a vulnerability of a lot of institutions where actually we need precisely that kind of informed amateur that is the politician. We have a problem of governments, or any party in government, wanting to misuse that for their own purposes, which means we really ought to be looking for much more multi-party decisions on these things. But certainly that kind of institution is another one of the things that can help us.
Okay, let's have another. Oh gosh, lots of hands.
Following on from the theme of the enthusiastic amateur, I sign about 10 online petitions every morning with my cup of coffee. But this morning, in particular, one caught my eye, and that was one which suggested that the rules of freedom of information don't apply to private bodies that deliver a public service in the way that they do apply to public bodies that deliver a public service. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, okay. Julia?
If I could just tell a story about traffic light labelling. We were, when I was working in number 10, we did try to...
Not many people can say that, by the way.
Sorry, but it is relevant to the topic. It wasn't just the name drop. Actually, I was working for Tony Blair. That used to be such a marked distinction. We were first discussing the business of trying to introduce traffic light labelling. It was before we actually realised that it was a European level directive rather something open to the British government. And I got taken out for lunch by Cadbury's, who were then under British control. It was a very good lunch. I declared it. And they tried to convince me that, that traffic light labelling was a terrible idea. And I started saying things like, couldn't you reduce the fat and sugar content of chocolate? And they said, chocolate is fat and sugar, basically. And then they said, and I had some sympathy with them, and it relates to a general point I wanted to make to you, which was, they said, it's ironic. We were set up, the chocolate, the big chocolate firms, were set up by Quakers. And we were set up by Quakers to curb the demon drink. And it's now us that are and now we're the demons, suddenly. And it does relate, I suppose, to a general point. I do feel that sometimes in what you say, although I must say towards the end of your talk, you were not saying that, you tend to assume that everybody in the private sector is a knave, if I may use that metaphor, and everyone in the public sector is a knight. Now, towards the end, as you said, as you pointed out, actually the public sector contains a lot of knaves as well, or more accurately, that both in the public sector and the private sector, there's a mixture of motivations going on of knightliness and knavery. And the trick, it seems to me, is first of all to recognise that. Your example of the financial incentives for GPs not to refer, of course that is trying to offset a financial incentive of GPs to over-refer, which exists. And in a way, it's it's one corruption trying to address another corruption, if you like. The trick is presumably actually to develop some kind of, and it relates to Tony's challenge to us to recognise what you're saying and to actually see if we can respond, is to try and find some kind of incentive structure that appeals to both the knight and the knave, that it does not send the knight and the knave working in opposite directions, like e.g. private practice for consultants, for example, which is a classic case of where knavish incentives drive you in one direction and knightly incentives drive one another. And so I think that's the trick, is to try and find incentive structures like that. I've often argued that it seemed to me that the old GP fund holding scheme was quite a neat one, by which doctors under that, GPs, had an incentive to under-refer, not to refer, to keep, but to invest any surplus they had and they made on their budgets on services for patients. Now that actually meant they improved the services for patients, that's appealing to the knight. They had an incentive to do that. But they also had an incentive to improve their premises and take on more staff or whatever, which actually served their own self-interest. So it appealed to both the knight and the knave in the GP. And it seemed to me that actually that was rather a clever way of actually trying to combine those two factors. So,
thanks. Laurie?
Thanks. I was going to refer to Julian's work, actually. I'm delighted that he got in first, about knights and knaves. It seems to be a matter of proportion, and of course nobody is all virtuous and not all private business is all villainous. But the degree and the danger and the risk of corruption is so enormous. Yes, public sector can be institutionally inert, lazy, idle, nobody prodded about enough. But that's not a very serious risk, and professionals can capture their industry and distort it in various ways. But again, that's not a very serious, they can be not as good as they ought to be and need to be sort of shaken up a bit, whether it's in medicine or teaching or university teaching or whatever. They need gingering up. But none of that is anything like the degree of risk the moment money enters into it. And, problems with GPs are partly that they're not directly employed by the state. Can't be told immediately what to do, have to be constantly incentivized in one form or another, whether as budget holders or whatever, or personally. And I think it's very important to hold on to that question of degree. Yes, there's a problem both sides, but the problem with banks and LIBOR fixing or the sorts of corruptions you've spoken about are of an enormously different order. So one shouldn't compare the knightery and the knavery, if you like, but just remember how much money does corrupt the moment it enters. And therefore, have we gone too far in disrespecting the professions? Isn't it time? You know, Thatcher utterly undermined them. Tony Blair pretty frustrated, scars on his back and all the rest of it by them. But didn't we really throw away too much of respect for professionalism and profession self-regulation, so long as money's not there?
Could I just try one thing on the back of that, and then next time I'll come over the other side and we'll do that. But and I'm sort of halfway between the two of you. I mean, the point I just would insert is, I mean, those of us on the sort of broad, on the political left in the broadest sense, are rightly very good at defending the public sector for all kinds of good reasons. And we're very good at analysing all those things which subvert it and you know, market mechanisms, and even then some of the target culture and all the other things that seem to, as it were, subvert the professional underpinnings of the public sector. We haven't been very good at thinking what we would do to it. I mean, I know it's not fashionable in any way to say that New Labour did anything any good, but actually I thought there was something in the argument which said, if we want people to believe in public services, if we want people to pay for them and to be happy to pay their taxes for them, we've got to show that we've got a way of making them work better, and we'll try things out to do that. And that was never a position that many people felt comfortable in accepting. They were far more comfortable in simply defending a public sector as was. And yeah, of course you can.
I think that was also a recipe for perpetual fidgety revolution of the kind that the health service has suffered a lot, and education, and changing the curriculum all the time and changing everything all the time to show that you're on the case. And that these big, done from the centre, pulling on the big levers changes are not always constructive. It does show that you're mindful of taxpayers getting value for money, but it doesn't always deliver it.
I think what I'm saying, Polly, is why were we not so interested in all the mechanisms that actually might produce sustained improvement in the way that public services operate? We were far more comfortable in seeing off what we saw as threats to it. That's all.
Don't forget, Milburn introduced those centres for doing straightforward orthopaedic work, because the orthopaedic surgeons were blatantly keeping up high waiting lists to pay for to drive their private practice, and the statistics were just unbeatable. That they had increased the number of orthopaedic surgeons because of the waiting lists, but the waiting list with double the number of orthopaedic surgeons had exactly the same number on the waiting list, so their private practice was not impinged. And I remember him bringing people in for private briefings and giving us the statistics. It was outrageous. It was very unpopular on the left to have these South African for-profit organisations, and some of them didn't work, but it was a good idea to try and show
Okay.
professional character.
When I was still gainfully employed as a university teacher, I was used to regard it as a really successful class if I hadn't been able to get a word in edgeways. This is a successful class. But before I get into that interesting debate that Julian Legrand and Polly Toynbee have started up, there's a lady at the front raised an interesting question about whether freedom of information applies to private firms. This is one of those areas that slips when you get a lot of privatisation of public services. Earlier there was an issue about whether firms contracting business from local authorities could claim commercial confidentiality and not reveal to councillors details of their service. When the service had been a public one, that they could get that information. Eventually, I think it was Pickles, the minister, who said this was outrageous and that firms couldn't claim commercial confidentiality. So my guess is that the government really wants to hold on to the privatising model, contracting out model, as one with integrity. It will be inclined to give in to this demand. I don't think they can hold out really on that. But on this issue that's grown up here, I think it is the case that it's easier to fix this issue in professional services, especially those that aren't at the front line of profit maximising activities, so people in charitable activities, public services. It's easier to fix it there than it is in the corporate sector for the reason that it's a truth universally acknowledged that these activities will have a mix of motives. That you don't expect a doctor to work for nothing, right? The fact that doctors might have some financial incentives to win merit awards, that they've joined the profession in order to get a decent salary. We're not assuming these people are all Francis of Assisi. That we are all wanting to earn a decent living, right? So it's not excluded that we have some financial motives, but it's also built into the assumption of our work that we have a kind of professional integrity. It's assumed that it would be an outrage if your doctor said you need an operation, because that doctor could then earn a lot of money for performing the operation. That would be considered an outrage. It would be an outrage if teachers gave high marks to children, because this would advance the reputation of the school, even if the children didn't deserve it. We are naturally outraged. Now, is there an equivalent in the private sector? The problem is, especially after the reforms to corporate governance that we've had in the last 20, 30 years, the sole aim of a corporation is to serve the interests of the shareholders. The interests of the shareholders is believed to be served by the maximisation of profit. This is meant to serve customers because in a competitive economy, unless you are meeting customers' demands, you will not maximise profit. Problem with that is, first, that not all sectors of the economy are perfectly competitive, and if there is imperfect competition, those motives will be inadequate. And secondly, it doesn't deal with externalities, it only deals with the relationship with customers. It doesn't deal with other people affected by a firm's behaviour. But if you've got the shareholder maximisation model, in theory, chief executives and other senior managers just have the role of as agents serving that principle. And so according to strict rules of corporate law, it would be wrong for a firm to put some kind of integrity, whether it's geology or engineering science, over profit maximisation unless they were confident that profits would be reduced by ignoring these other goals. Now, retrospectively, British petroleum engineers are probably saying, yeah, you'd have maximised profits actually if you'd listened to us. But ex ante, it's not so easy to do that. And we don't have a mechanism for saying firms ought to be at some level serving anything other than profit maximisation unless it pleases customers. And there's a very uneven kind of playing field at the moment where firms that are in competitive sectors that are brand names, where customers link the brand to the behaviour, and which are active in societies where people are caring about these things, firms in that situation are under a lot of pressure to build into their profit maximisation model decent behaviour. In areas where it's not so easy for us to discover what they're on about, or when they're not brand name firms, but the firms a long way along the production chain, then that model doesn't work so well, and we don't really have any method. Now, I just said brand name firms should be sensitive, but as I keep saying today, the banks don't seem to have suffered from that, right? Now, some people in the financial sector will say to you, it is absurd expecting us to behave ourselves, to have good behaviour, because as soon as we do that, we will lose out on deals to those pursuing bad behaviour, and our bank may cease to exist. You can't expect us to do it ourselves. You've got to regulate us. And then, of course, you go around and try and regulate them, and you find they're sitting in the minister's office lobbying why you should be regulated. But the problem is that in the whole professional area, we do have this notion that there's something other than maximisation of profit. In the area of of private business, it's not clear that we have such a concept well established.
As time gets shorter, I'm going to take a run of people so everyone feels they've got a chance to say something. Then Colin can pick up.
Yeah, I'll come back right at the end. Yeah.
Can I just go to you first?
Hi, I work in performance and impact, so this has turned out to be very, very relevant. I've got two but very concise questions. The first is around timescales. So I feel like all the profit maximisation that you've spoken about is at relatively short timescales. And as you mentioned, BP in the long term have not profit maximised. Often with the NHS as well, it takes a number of years for savings to come through. For example, short-term improvements in home care, long-term cost saving in beds. So could we do something about this by re-evaluating the timescales in which we measure profit or other outcomes? The second is around kind of understanding of performance management. So I help people set targets and spend half my time trying to persuade them that they're not the be-all and end-all and that they're only a guide. But I feel that in general, we don't educate people about the mechanisms of performance management enough that they're comfortable to challenge it, both on the responsive side and the contractual side. So is there more to be done there to help people sort of have a respectful disregard for the targets they're set?
Yeah. Beautifully concise. Could I ask everybody to be concise like that? Then we'll get a lot of people in. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and be concise. I want to pick out this citizens and customers to an extent, because we've not drawn the distinction enough about citizens being part of a polity with mutual responsibility and customers only having interests of their own to minimise costs and maximise personal benefit. And we get that. You said that parents wanted a number because of league tables. We have to go back to why we have league tables, because it's a mystification, idealisation of markets and choice in a place where they don't operate very well. I mean, just at a basic level, if I look in Which and try to select a washing machine, it gives me 12 different parameters. Whereas the school is meant, which is far more complex than a washing machine, is meant to be described by one number. And it's because excessive choice is disabling. You know, we cannot make a choice between, if you're in London, 30 or 40 different schools. Because we no longer see schools as part of community, we see them as a commodity and a product. And so, by making these false assertions about how you can work out what is best for your child, because it's only my child that I'm now interested in. You produce this very coarse form of inspection and performance management. And it's difficult, enough when, if you're choosing cereal, and therefore you can't make a choice in cereal, so you go by the colour of the packet. If you choose the school just by going to the top of the league table, and not everything can be at the top, My experience as a parent is what you have to avoid is those ones which are the few at the bottom, which are seriously bad and need remedial attention, rather than believing that every school can be the best, which it clearly can't.
Okay, I think we've got the... sorry to interrupt, but I think we've got the point. That's good. Thanks. Simon.
John Strafford. I'm a retired chartered accountant, and I put it to you that actually the professions have ceased to exist, and until we put that right, we're not going to make any progress. I started Article Clerks 1960, on 5-year articles, and at that time the accountancy profession, certainly the firms I work for, were primarily concerned with doing audit work. There was a sense of service in the firm, and then over the years they took on consultancy work, they took on tax avoidance work, and it ended up in the 1980s when I had, by that time, got my own group of companies, and I had one of the big four doing the audit of one of them, and was charged £5,000 for half an hour's work by an unqualified assistant and complained. I was told, oh, the audit fee is an insurance premium. If anything's gone wrong, you just sue us. And that ends up with firms of accountants and partners being paid obscene salaries, and when they are not doing the work, where the banks go bust for hundreds of millions of pounds, having received clean audit reports 6 months before from the auditors. And these very same people are being employed in government, And one moment they're the head of the Inland Revenue, the next moment they're employed by a big four firm of accountants. You know, until the politicians sort all this out and get the professions back to being professional bodies, then this whole saga, which I find very pessimistic, will continue.
That's good. You should add the big four accountancy firms to your list, by the way. Yeah.
Ed Rosen. I've spent the last 15 years setting targets for the NHS, and I thought your observations were very welcome. Tomorrow I'm responsible for setting targets with all GP practices in Lambeth, and tomorrow I'm going to be in Stockwell talking to GPs about how we work together to set a target. And the context in which we're setting targets is the huge increase in malnutrition in the borough. We have 15,000 people in Lambeth who are accessing a food bank. The year before it was 6,000. We have 6,000 residents in Lambeth who are at risk of malnutrition. Now, the reason I'm just plonking that into the discussion is, what target should we set for malnutrition in an advanced industrial society? And the point, you don't have to answer it because there isn't an answer. We're sometimes looking in the wrong place. The thought of setting a target for starvation in London would have been quite sobering for us at the LSE in 1968. We're in this reality, and we're in a situation of growing inequality, which is having an impact on the decisions that are taken by GPs in our borough. And I'm sure the reference that you've made to GPs earlier on, Colin, I'd want to challenge absolutely and fundamentally. I think you're looking in the wrong place. You need to look at Mid Staffordshire as expression of as an example of a system overloaded with competing messages from different parts of the state. When I've set targets, and I think the point you raised was a really important one, the art of engaging is around effective and democratic implementation. It's a whole systems approach. That is often extremely difficult for professionals to engage with, because it means some professionals giving up power in order for an empowered citizenry to emerge as an active force in our public sector. Sorry to go on.
No, thanks for that. Ask Colin to pick up anything he wants, and I'll just try one quick further round if we can afterwards. Depends on how long this takes. If I can put it that way.
I'll only pick on a few things, then, won't I? One theme that comes out of a number of the comments was, about the role of targets and how you can do them. And that fact about the need for targets to be part of a discourse, that you need, that people being given targets need to be able to talk back to the target setting, and targets must not be just box ticking, but are narratives about how to improve. That's obviously extremely important. Now, the problem is it works differently for different groups. You see that the university teachers have been in a state about certain gaming and corruption of the research excellence framework. Nick Stern is able to talk to a minister about that. Nick Stern then gets appointed to chair a review of the REF, which means next time it will be much better. Care assistants somewhere in Britain, fed up with the target system they're under. There's no one they can talk to, no one they will listen to, no one will ever appoint any of them to do anything. So that there is an imbalance, and it's see, although my book talks about professions a lot, near the beginning I say what I mean by professions is the skill anyone uses in their work. It's the fact that a practitioner of a skill has something to say about how their work is done, and that has to be entered into the mix, even though we are vulnerable and corrupt and need to be monitored all the time, all of us do. The things about accountancy, all I can do is just listen to that, right? That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Thanks, Colin. We will therefore do a final round. So if you could really make it snappy, that'd be great. Thanks. Yes, please.
So far, the discussion has focused on the politicians, the customers, to a certain extent, professionals, and the money man, and we have left out the citizens. We've been talking a lot about professionals, what can be done, regulatory bodies, and so on and so forth, and the money man. And I wonder if this is not a problem, leaving out the citizens. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
Okay. There was a lady further back, yeah.
Thank you. Just want to ask you, Colin, what you think professionals can do in the current climate? Because my feeling about professionals is that we stand as a barrier between the citizens and the customers, protecting them from the politicians and the money men. And I think many people here are professionals would say that we have been attacked as professionals, both in education and medicine and all the rest of it, because we are that barrier between those two groups. I met somebody from the Department of Health a couple of years ago who said, well, of course, they hate doctors there. And what they're going to do is they're going to deprofessionalize you in the three following ways. They're going to make too many doctors, so there's medical unemployment. They're going to mess up medical education, which they did with MTAS, and they're going to undermine the Royal Colleges. And all those things have happened. So what do you think that professionals should be doing when our role as the people who protect our citizens and our customers from the politicians and the money men is being undermined the whole time? And targets is part of that, because what they've done is given the managers the power to overrule clinicians, say, in medicine by saying you can put patients on this list who don't actually have any clinical problem, but they're going to break a target over somebody whose clinical need is great. So the power of professionals has been eroded and eroded because of this. And you see what's happening to junior doctors at the moment. They're going to start training people so that they're factory fodder to work in the NHS. So what are we going to do about it? Thank you.
Citizens. Surely it all comes down to the difference between the salary of the lowest person in the company and the salary of the highest, and there should be a set ratio. Say it should never be more than 20 times the boss man than the ordinary person, because then we wouldn't have these terrible differences in salaries, and then you wouldn't have people starving and malnutrition in Lambeth.
Okay, I think we've done with, unless I'm not seeing any, I think we've done almost done.
No, it's okay.
No, I'm not stopping anybody. But if you're really quick,
I will keep it very brief. We've been looking at this almost exclusively in a national context. I wonder if we can make real progress in doing that. Do we need to look at it in a cross-national context? It strikes me that the pluralist mix in terms of regulation, quality control, checks on integrity and so on varies from country to country. I wonder if there are any cross-country comparisons.
Okay, thanks. Don?
Well, I want to go back to the point made about citizens. If you compare today's citizens with the good old citizens of the good old days in the 1950s, it's night and day. In the 1950s, it was almost impossible for citizens to obtain information about anything. Now, it's extraordinarily easy. That means that the professionals are far more constrained by the knowledge of what is it that might happen if they say something wrong. And so, just take one short example. If you are asked, what should we do at airports on security? A guy had tried to put a bomb in his shoes. What are we going to do? Now, you may think, well, this is just one guy who put a bomb in his shoes, never mind. Or you say, we are going to have millions of people every day removing their shoes, invest in machines to check the shoes, etc., etc., in the knowledge that if in 6 months' time someone actually kills someone with their shoes, then someone is going to blame you. In other words, there is a non-risk or a low-risk bias, which is inbuilt in a lot of professional advice. which is, in other words, it's not just the money, the corruption and so on, but it's just the fear of the demos.
And my question is, didn't the professionals try to stop the National Health Service being set up? And does any of this tell us whether we should be on the side of the junior doctors or not?
I can reply to all these, but I don't have time. What is it best to do? I think just pick out on this particular of the position of professionals in relationship to the politicians, I suppose, and also the kind of managerial class. In that there is a real conflict between professionals on the one hand saying, we're the ones who know how to do this job, and you're interfering with us. And the managers and the politicians saying, we don't actually trust you to do it, and so we are going to interfere with the way you do it. And then the professions, and actually, given the different trust levels that there are between politicians and business persons as opposed to professions, the citizens and the professions say, well, actually, we don't trust you people who are claiming to regulate and control the professionals either. And so I think we are back at the fundamental problem that we can't actually manage even our daily lives without trusting each other. If you really had zero trust, you couldn't walk down the street without fearing someone's going to attack you at every step. Most of the time we have to trust that either people are decent or at least they're too lazy to do evil. And that assumption will get you through most of life. The problem is that at a whole series of points, we face incentives to behave in unethical ways in all of our walks of life. And I can't get beyond my idea that we need a series of different mechanisms that regulate all of us, including regulating, of course, the regulators. Whether is this all at national level, just an extra point on that. Now, obviously, there are different ways in which these things are done. I mean, this book I've written, it draws almost entirely on British examples. It sold most copies, with far more successfully in its German edition than its English one. I don't know why. Probably because it was published a week before the Volkswagen scandal.
Well, look, it's an enormous tribute to Colin that we've stimulated such lively discussion. It means that he's talking about things that we know to be important and that we are all trying to work our way through. So I think, we are really extraordinarily grateful for that. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you for the question.
And then just before you go, because we've got a drink for you, is don't forget Colin's books, bargain offer outside. And I should have said at the beginning, on behalf of the Political Quarterly, whose lecture this is, that we'd like you to read the Political Quarterly. We'd like you to buy it, and there is a magnificent, merely £10 online offer to get all the issues. So please think about that as well. And then just finally to end, now Julian mentioned Cadbury's. I live downwind from, you'll remember this, I live downwind from Cadbury's, and I play tennis every week with a senior manager there, and there's a lot of discussion, as you probably know, about the deterioration in Cadbury cream eggs.
Yes.
They're not what they were, as you all know. But he tells me, I don't want this to go any further.
Some change.
When Cadbury's launch a new product, they make it of high quality. This is just grist to your mill. They make it of high quality. And then when it's been on the market for a while, they bring the quality content down. And he tells me this is common amongst all the chocolate manufacturers. Wow. I thought I'd pass that on. Yes.